The words hit my ear like ice water while I was balancing my sleeping 2-year-old son on my hip and trying to juggle a plate of birthday cake. My husband David's breath was warm against my neck, but his voice carried a terror I'd never heard before. "We are leaving. Something is very, very wrong." I looked around the crowded living room at Grandpa's 90th birthday party. 3 generations of our family laughing and sharing stories. My cousin's kids running between chairs, my aunt serving seconds of her famous lasagna, and everything looked perfectly normal. But David's hand was gripping my elbow so tightly it hurt, and when I followed his gaze toward the hallway where he'd just returned from using the bathroom, I saw my Uncle Frank quickly closing what looked like Grandpa's bedroom door. The expression on Frank's face wasn't guilt or embarrassment. It was a calculation. And in that moment, I realized that the man we'd all trusted to take care of our beloved grandfather wasn't protecting him at all. My name is Valentina, and before that birthday party shattered everything I thought I knew about my family, I had built my life around the assumption that blood meant safety. Every Sunday after church, David and I would drive to my grandfather's house with our son Oliver, spending the afternoon helping with yard work or small repairs while Oliver played with the wooden trains Grandpa had carved himself. The house was a modest ranch-style place in a neighborhood that had seen better days, but Grandpa had lived there for 43 years and refused to even consider moving somewhere more manageable. During the week, I worked as a physical therapist at Sunrise Rehabilitation Center, helping stroke patients and accident victims regain mobility and independence. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying. There's something powerful about watching someone take their first steps after months of struggle, or seeing the light return to their eyes when they realize they can still live the life they want. I'd been doing it for 8 years, and I was good at recognizing when someone was being mistreated or neglected. I knew the signs of elder abuse, had reported suspected cases to social services, had even testified in court about injuries that didn't match the explanations families provided. But somehow, I'd been blind to what was happening in my own family. Uncle Frank had moved in with Grandpa 6 months earlier, ostensibly to help with cooking and cleaning and making sure medications were taken on time. Frank was my father's younger brother, recently divorced and between jobs, and it had seemed like the perfect solution when Grandpa started having trouble managing stairs and remembering appointments. The family had been relieved to have someone living there full-time, someone who could drive Grandpa to doctor visits and handle the day-to-day tasks that had become increasingly difficult. I thought we were taking care of each other the way family should. I thought I was paying attention to the right things. If stories like this make you think about your own family differently, make sure you're subscribed. Sometimes the truth is hiding in plain sight. The warning signs had been accumulating for months, but I'd explained every single one away. The first red flag came in February when I stopped by unannounced to drop off some soup I'd made for Grandpa's cold. Frank answered the door looking flustered, saying Grandpa was napping and couldn't be disturbed. Through the partially open bedroom door, I could see my grandfather sitting up in bed, fully dressed, staring at nothing. When I called out to say hello, Frank quickly closed the door and guided me toward the kitchen, explaining that the medication made Grandpa confused and it was better not to overstimulate him. At the time, it seemed reasonable. Grandpa had been prescribed several new medications after a minor heart episode, and the doctor had warned us about potential side effects including drowsiness and disorientation. Frank was just being protective, making sure Grandpa got the rest he needed to recover properly. The second warning came during a family dinner in March. Grandpa seemed unusually quiet and kept looking toward Frank before answering even simple questions about his day or how he was feeling. When my cousin Maria asked about his woodworking projects, something he'd always loved talking about, Grandpa started to respond enthusiastically, but then glanced at Frank and went silent. Frank smoothly redirected the conversation, saying the workshop had been too cold lately and Grandpa was taking a break from projects until spring. But I'd been in that workshop the week before, helping David carry some lumber inside, and it had been perfectly warm. The space heater was running, and several half-finished projects were sitting on the workbench like Grandpa had just stepped away from them. When I mentioned this to my mother later, she said Frank was probably just being cautious about Grandpa using power tools while adjusting to new medications. The most disturbing incident happened in early April. I arrived for our usual Sunday visit to find Grandpa wearing the same clothes he'd had on the previous week, and they weren't clean. His hair looked like it hadn't been washed in days, and there was a smell in the house that reminded me of the nursing home where I'd volunteered during college, that mixture of unwashed bodies and stale air that happens when someone stops taking care of basic hygiene. When I asked Frank about it, he got defensive and said taking care of an elderly person was harder than I realized. That Grandpa was resistant to bathing and changing clothes, that it was a constant battle, and that he was doing his best under difficult circumstances. He made me feel guilty for even bringing it up, like I was criticizing his sacrifice instead of advocating for Grandpa's dignity. The birthday party was supposed to be a celebration of Grandpa's remarkable life, 90 years of marriage and children and grandchildren, of building furniture with his hands and growing vegetables in his backyard and teaching 3 generations of kids how to fish in the creek behind his house. The whole extended family had gathered, maybe 30 people in total, bringing covered dishes and old photo albums and stories about the man who'd been the steady center of our family for as long as anyone could remember. But from the moment we walked through the front door, something felt off. Grandpa was sitting in his recliner in the living room, dressed in clean clothes and smiling at everyone, but there was something hollow about his expression. He seemed to be performing being himself rather than actually being present. When people approached to hug him or wish him happy birthday, he'd respond appropriately but kept glancing toward the kitchen where Frank was busy playing host. David had noticed it too. While I was helping in the kitchen and chasing Oliver around the crowded house, he'd been observing family dynamics with the sharp eye that made him such a good detective. He'd watched Frank hover around Grandpa, intercepting conversations and answering questions directed at our grandfather. He'd noticed how Frank never left Grandpa alone with anyone for more than a few minutes, always finding reasons to interrupt or redirect. The breaking point came when David excused himself to use the bathroom and walked down the hallway toward Grandpa's bedroom. What he found there made his blood run cold. The bedroom had been stripped of almost everything personal, no more photos on the dresser, no books on the nightstand, no woodworking magazines stacked on the chair. The room looked institutional, sterile, like a patient's room in a facility rather than the personal space of someone who'd lived in this house for 4 decades. But it was what David overheard that made him understand the scope of what was happening. Frank was on the phone in the bedroom, speaking in low tones to someone about power of attorney paperwork and asset transfers and timeline for property sales. He was talking about Grandpa like he was already dead, discussing financial arrangements with the casual efficiency of someone who'd been planning this for months. When Frank noticed David in the hallway, he quickly ended the call and came out of the bedroom, closing the door firmly behind him. He made some excuse about handling medical bills and insurance paperwork, but David had heard enough to understand that this wasn't caregiving. It was systematic exploitation of a vulnerable elderly man by someone who'd positioned himself as the trusted family caretaker. That night, after we'd made our excuses and left the party early, I sat at our kitchen table while David told me everything he'd seen and heard. Oliver was finally asleep upstairs, and the house was quiet except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as the full picture became clear. Frank hadn't moved in to help Grandpa, he'd moved in to isolate him, control him, and systematically steal everything he'd worked for over 90 years. The medication confusion, the restricted access, the gradual removal of personal belongings, it was textbook elder abuse. The kind I'd been trained to recognize in my professional life, but had somehow missed when it was happening to my own grandfather. Frank had been playing the devoted nephew while slowly erasing Grandpa's autonomy and preparing to claim his assets. I felt sick thinking about how many times I'd praised Frank for his sacrifice, how grateful the whole family had been to have someone willing to take on the responsibility of caring for an aging relative. We'd been so relieved to have a solution that we hadn't questioned whether it was actually working for the person who mattered most. But underneath the guilt and horror, I felt something else building, a cold, focused rage that reminded me why I'd chosen to work with vulnerable populations in the first place. I'd seen what happened when people preyed on those who couldn't protect themselves, and I'd never hesitated to act when I witnessed it in professional settings. The fact that this was my family, that Frank was my uncle, that confronting him would create chaos and division and pain for people I loved, none of that mattered more than protecting my grandfather from someone who'd been systematically betraying his trust. Frank had counted on family loyalty and social politeness to provide cover for his crimes. But he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed no one would be watching closely enough to see what he was really doing. Monday morning, I called in sick to work and drove straight to the elder abuse hotline office. I'd referred clients there before, but being on the other side of the intake process was humbling and terrifying. The caseworker, a woman named Patricia who'd been handling these cases for 15 years, listened to my concerns with professional sympathy but explained the challenges we'd face in building a case. Elder abuse investigations required documentation, medical evidence, financial records, and preferably testimony from the victim, all things that would be difficult to obtain while Frank was controlling access to Grandpa. They could do a wellness check, but if Grandpa appeared to be receiving adequate care and didn't report abuse himself, there wasn't much they could do immediately. Frank had been clever about maintaining appearances and would likely be prepared for official scrutiny. My first attempt to gather evidence nearly backfired completely. I tried visiting Grandpa during the day while Frank was supposedly running errands, but he was never gone long enough for me to have a real conversation or look around the house thoroughly. When I suggested taking Grandpa out for lunch, Frank politely declined on his behalf, saying the excitement and change in routine was too much for someone his age. I tried enlisting other family members, but most of them thought I was overreacting. Frank had done such a good job of positioning himself as the long-suffering caregiver that questioning his motives felt like attacking someone who'd made significant personal sacrifices for the family. My cousin Maria actually told me I should be more appreciative of Frank's dedication instead of looking for problems where none existed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chin, Grandpa's neighbor for 20 years, called me at home one evening to express concern about what she'd been observing. She'd noticed that Grandpa's workshop light hadn't been on in months, that his garden was overgrown and neglected, and that she never saw him outside anymore even on beautiful days. Most disturbing, she'd seen Frank loading furniture and boxes into a truck several times, always when Grandpa wasn't visible. Mrs. Chen had been hesitant to get involved in family business, but something about Frank's behavior during the birthday party, the way he'd positioned himself between Grandpa and everyone else, had convinced her that intervention was necessary. She offered to let me use her house to observe Grandpa's routine and document Frank's activities without being detected. The confrontation happened on a Thursday afternoon in late May. I'd spent 2 weeks documenting Frank's pattern of isolating Grandpa, photographing furniture and personal items being removed from the house, and gathering evidence of financial irregularities with help from David's contacts in white-collar crime investigation. But most importantly, I'd convinced Patricia from Elder Services to coordinate a surprise visit while Frank was at what he'd told the family was a doctor's appointment with Grandpa. When we arrived at the house with Patricia and a police officer, we found Grandpa alone, sitting in his recliner in a room that had been stripped of almost everything that made it his home. The family photos were gone. The bookshelf was empty, and the comfortable clutter that had always characterized his living space had been replaced by the stark functionality of an institution. But it was Grandpa's reaction to seeing us that broke my heart and confirmed everything I'd suspected. When I walked into the room, his face lit up with genuine joy for the first time in months. He grabbed my hands and said he'd been hoping someone would visit, that he'd been feeling lonely and confused about why Frank wouldn't let people come see him anymore. The story that emerged during Patricia's interview was exactly what I'd feared. Frank had been systematically isolating Grandpa from family and friends, controlling his medications to keep him compliant and disoriented, and slowly removing valuable items from the house under the pretense of decluttering. He'd convinced Grandpa to sign financial documents by telling him they were routine medical forms, and he'd been intercepting mail and phone calls to prevent anyone from discovering what was happening. When Frank returned from his supposed doctor's appointment and found us there, his mask slipped completely. Gone was the caring nephew persona, replaced by cold calculation and barely controlled rage at having his scheme exposed. He tried to maintain his innocent facade, claiming everything he'd done was for Grandpa's own good, but the evidence was overwhelming. The police officer arrested him on the spot for elder abuse and financial exploitation. As they led him away in handcuffs, Frank looked directly at me with an expression of pure hatred and said I'd destroyed the family over my own paranoid suspicions. But sitting next to my grandfather, holding his hand while he told Patricia about months of subtle intimidation and control, I knew I'd done exactly what needed to be done. The legal process took nearly a year, but Frank was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of elder abuse and financial fraud. The investigation revealed that he'd stolen more than $40,000 in cash and valuables, forged Grandpa's signature on documents transferring property rights, and systematically isolated him from support systems that might have exposed the abuse earlier. Grandpa moved in with my parents while we figured out long-term care arrangements, and watching him slowly return to himself was like watching someone emerge from a long illness. His confusion cleared as his medications were properly managed by doctors who weren't being manipulated by Frank. His personality began to shine through again as he reconnected with family members and resumed activities he enjoyed. The hardest part was dealing with family members who'd initially defended Frank and felt guilty about not recognizing what was happening. Some relatives struggled with anger at themselves for being deceived, while others directed their frustration at me for being the one who'd exposed the truth. Family gatherings were tense for months as everyone processed the betrayal and tried to rebuild trust. But slowly, gradually, we found our way back to each other. Grandpa's 91st birthday was a smaller, quieter celebration, but it felt genuine in a way the previous year's party hadn't. He was present and engaged, telling stories and asking questions and being fully himself instead of performing a role that Frank had scripted for him. I returned to work with a deeper understanding of how abuse can hide in plain sight, especially when it's perpetrated by someone in a position of trust. I started volunteering with the Elder Abuse Prevention Program, training family members to recognize signs that might not be obvious to people who aren't looking for them. 6 months after Frank's conviction, I was cleaning out Grandpa's workshop to help him resume his woodworking projects when I found a journal hidden behind some old paint cans. The entries, written in Grandpa's careful handwriting, documented months of Frank's psychological manipulation and control. But what struck me most was an entry from the week before his 90th birthday party. Grandpa had written about feeling hopeless and isolated, about wondering if anyone in the family would notice if something was wrong, about praying that someone would see past Frank's performance to the reality of what was happening. He'd written about the birthday party being his last chance to somehow signal for help without directly confronting Frank and risking even worse treatment. Reading those words, I realized that Grandpa had been fighting back in the only way he could by being present at his own birthday party, by enduring Frank's control long enough for someone to notice the inconsistencies. His survival had depended on family members who cared enough to look beyond surface appearances and ask difficult questions. The experience taught me that protection isn't just about responding to obvious signs of abuse, it's about maintaining connections that make abuse harder to hide. It's about trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you can't immediately articulate why. It's about remembering that the people who seem most helpful might sometimes be the ones causing the most harm. Frank had counted on family loyalty and social politeness to provide cover for his crimes. He'd assumed that no one would want to create conflict by questioning his motives or examining his methods too closely. But he'd underestimated the power of love that refuses to look away, even when the truth is painful and complicated. Sometimes the people we trust to protect our most vulnerable family members are the ones they most need protection from. But that doesn't mean we stop trusting, it means we trust more carefully, more completely, with our eyes wide open and our hearts fully engaged.